I always think of Kherson as like a medieval battle of moats. You know, the river is what separates you from the enemy, and they're firing almost like cannonballs through artillery at you, and you're safe from the buildings that face north of that city. You know, it's very geographical and it's very based on nature, which is very unusual. We don't think of warfare being like that anymore. We think of it as all digital and nuclear, but actually it is pretty much like that. But the threat now is from drones. The artillery is almost redundant, and they can see you everywhere, and saboteurs are everywhere. There's a lot of Russians who have infiltrated that city. I mean, I assume I was overheard or seen by a couple of Russian saboteurs because they're that common in that city, and they will send your location to the Russians, and then they'll send a drone after you. They'll say, there's a journalist here, I've just heard them had a conversation outside a coffee shop. So I mean, the only analogies that I have to describe that city are Hollywood movies like Mad Max and James Bond, because it's so extreme and unusual.
Today, I'm actually delighted to welcome back Caolan Robertson. We had a very short chat on the channel. This was more than a year ago, and at the time there were numerous comments and requests for us to repeat it and to dive into a bit more of a lengthy conversation. Well, I'm delighted that we've got the chance to do that. Caolan is a journalist, a filmmaker, a co-creator of Frontline with Byline TV, director of Under Deadly Skies, and has been living in Odessa for a number of weeks now, or a couple of months now. We'll certainly get into the details in a second, and there's a lot of interesting things going on there. If you haven't seen Under Deadly Skies, then we will pop a link to where it's available on streaming services, because it is a fantastic piece of work that he did there with the inimitable John Sweeney. Caolan, though, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you back.
Thank you for having me back. I can't believe it's been longer than a year. That's wild.
We are 3 years into this almost, and I'd say there's no end in sight. I mean, there isn't. We don't know what the end game of this is, but there are multiple scenarios for that. I doubt whether it's going to be over by Christmas, you know, as they say. We may well have a considerable period of time still to go, despite the appalling costs of the war on the Ukrainian side. I mean, there are costs on the Russian side as well, but of course we focus on the Ukrainians, who are victims of the aggressor. Now, that was a fairly short intro. I would love to learn more detail about what you've been up to in the year and a bit since we last spoke. You have, of course, immersed yourself in Ukrainian life and spent a great deal more time there on the ground. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, the last time I saw you, it was at the premiere of the documentary that I directed with John Sweeney that took us from the Donbass to Kherson. And I went back to London after that film was shot, and I edited it for 3 months. And that film ended up winning 12 awards. And I was flown to Paris, the pre-bio, to numerous different countries, and was taken to sort of canapé events and all these sort of nice, flashy events, and was again living back in glamorous London. And I couldn't stop thinking about all the people that I'd filmed and all the people that I'd met in the east and the south of this country. And it felt like wrong, and it felt like I couldn't go back to my original reporting, even in the UK, and going to these nice events, you know, talking about the price of potatoes going up by a percentage because of Brexit, talking about, you know, Labour versus Conservative, when I was basically witnessing a genocide in the east of Europe. And so I became almost obsessed with returning back to this country and finishing the story, because when I left, the story didn't end. It actually got worse. It became more of a nightmare, and I saw that on my newsfeed. So months and months went by, and I ended up leaving Byline TV full time. I still produce their show Frontline with Byline every week, which is great. That does really well. But I ended up making the decision to move to Odessa, because I know I have certain journalists who are friends that live here. Zarina Zabriskie lives here. Paul Conroy lives here. And I love Odessa. I visited here after Kherson last year, and it's just the most beautiful city ever. And I wanted this as a base to think about how to report and what to do next here. And so that was 2 months ago, which I can't believe I'm even saying now. It's flown by so much. And within weeks of arriving here, I started seeing endless propaganda that was being carried out by paid shills. We had the tenant media scandal break within a week of me arriving here. And I used to work with and know some of the presenters at Tenet Media. And so immediately wasn't surprised by that story and started to deep dive into it. And people seemed to be interested in that reporting. Then we had a young 24-year-old kid called Nick Shirley arrive in this country and produce TikTok content from downtown Kyiv, pretending there wasn't a war happening that was getting millions of views on TikTok. This is a MAGA style creator, this kid that did this, and it was an unprecedented type of propaganda that I haven't really seen produced in the capital of a country at war before. So I confronted him, and that got about 500,000 views and shut down a lot of the reputation that he had, and I think combated a lot of the propaganda that he was putting out.
Well, I think what you were doing is to try and show that there maybe isn't a war in Ukraine. You were basically trying to ride this sort of Tim Pool grifter type wave, saying, you know, pulling silly faces, smirking at the people of this country, saying, this is where your tax dollars are going. You cannot avoid that. That is literally what you did. Everybody agrees. Everybody in the comments agrees. That's what you were doing. Why can't you admit that?
And sort of then realized that that doing independent reporting as often as I possibly could was proving to be quite effective. So my friend Serena lives in Kherson almost full time, which is a 2.5-hour drive from here this way, at the other side of the Black Sea. I'd been there before, and she called me up and she said, Caolan, things have gotten drastically worse in this city since you were last here. Things are rapidly changing in Ukraine, and you can really, really feel it. And she said we should start doing on-the-ground reporting again, which led to that second film. But the second I crossed the border from Moldova and arrived in this country 8 weeks ago, I immediately felt at home, which is strange. Both of my parents are adopted, but my dad did a detective test, a DNA test recently, and found that my great-grandparents are buried in Odessa, which is probably why I find it so connected here. I feel like
that's
I only realized that since I moved here. That is extraordinary. And so then I started to, really feel a connection here. And this city is like French meets Italian meets Cuba meets the Mediterranean in terms of its architecture and its dining. It's just amazing. There's no air defense system here, so at night it's incredibly noisy. Ballistic missiles hit the port here every single night in the last 7 days. And on Wednesday, they killed 15 people. On Thursday, they killed 7. On Friday, they killed 4. And there isn't the same Patriot air defense system here because the US hasn't supplied a lot of stuff. And so it's more on edge. It's more risky. The Russians are much closer because the Black Sea Fleet is there, which I can't see it, but I can see over the Black Sea. So it's a little bit more extreme, but it's the most resilient city I've seen as well. People just carry on in the aftermath of missile attacks. They clean up and they turn on the generators if the power goes out, and they go to the beach. And it's pretty inspiring. It's such an amazing place. It just feels, it feels like the Wild West in a lot of ways, but it's really incredible. And, there's been a lot of conversation about Crimea recently. President of Turkey, Erdogan, said 4 weeks ago that Crimea is Ukraine, which is unprecedented. Blinken recently said Crimea is Ukraine, which is unprecedented. David Lammy said the same thing. We haven't had Western leaders or many mainstream leaders saying rhetoric like that around Crimea recently. So I think there might be some interesting things happening there soon. But I won't go into strategy. I think it's been a very interesting place to live. But yeah, and this is it. For the foreseeable future, I'll be here. I mean, a lot of tourists, not tourists, but people who are visiting this country, NGOs, tourists, whoever they are, can only be here for around 3 months. But the type of accreditation that I have managed to get because of my previous working here, which is a military press accreditation, allows me to be here indefinitely. So that's fantastic. It means I can basically be based here at least until the war is over, and then to film the rebuilding and demining of Ukraine. So it feels like it's going to be a long road, but I'm really excited to keep showing the world what's happening here.
Well, we'll talk about Kherson in a minute, because you've been producing some films there which have really grabbed some attention, which of course is important, but there are some nuances about how these stories have to be packaged up. Does it concern you that stories like demining and reconstruction are even less sexy, as it were, in news terms than large-scale strikes, or let's say the Storm Shadow strike against the Black Sea Fleet? There are certain moments which kind of grab the headlines. We noticed that as well this summer. There was a huge re-engagement on the subject of Ukraine in the initial weeks when Kursk was invaded. About sort of 6 to 8 weeks into that, there was a palpable, reinflation, as it were, of the audience and the engagement and the time people watched videos and the number of videos that were watched. That has now slipped again. But do you worry about this huge story of reconstruction and demining will just not cut through?
I think that those stories will cut through eventually, but not immediately. The ending to Under Deadly Skies / The Eastern Front, the film I made with John, finished with a quote from Eisenhower after World War II saying, "Get it all on video, get it all on tape, because one day down the line, someone's going to say that none of this happened." And so my primary goal is to gather evidence of everything that's happening, to gather evidence of war crimes, to gather evidence of what's going on here. Because I know that someday down the line, it might not be immediate, it might not go viral overnight, but people will see what happened here because the truth always gets out. So that's the main focus of capturing it. It can be depressing having to package footage in a way that is quite sexy and overdramatic, because actually what's happening in Ukraine is shocking. Every single day, there are war crimes committed en masse in every oblast in this country. But it's no longer interesting to Western audiences for a multitude of reasons. One is the press, the mainstream media is dying. They don't have the ability and the finances to report what's going on the ground in the way that they used to do. The second is we have short attention spans as a population now. So we can no longer care about a war that goes on longer than 6 months, despite in human history, wars take sometimes decades to end. The Ukraine situation is fairly normal for a war to go on for longer than 3 years. And so it can be a bit annoying, but, as a journalist, I have to package things myself now. 10, 20 years ago, if I was working on Fleet Street, I could have delivered the stories I got in Kherson to my editor, and then they would give that to a graphic designer. They would make it look good, and then it would be sent down to the printers in the base of Fleet Street, and then it would be distributed across the UK. That was the system, and it meant that journalists could focus on the story. Now it's almost as if you're a journalist who has to do that entire production process themselves. You've got to not just give it to an editor. You've got to go downstairs to the printing press, print it yourself, which is like making a thumbnail. Uploading it yourself, and then you've got to market it yourself. It would be as if you printed 10,000 copies of The Sun, and then you had to sell them by hand the next day to people up and down the UK. So it means you really have to rely on making stuff that looks more flashy, that looks, as exciting and cutting edge as possible. And sometimes it feels like that can cheapen your journalism, which I feel like that sometimes, because again, what's happening in Kherson is so dramatic. It doesn't need sound effects. It doesn't need music. It doesn't need a glossy thumbnail, but because of Western fatigue, because of dying mainstream media, and because of competition from Russian propagandists saying this isn't happening, you've got to have an edge to all of this kind of content. And it's annoying, but it gets the word out. The documentary I made in Kherson myself last week already has 1.5, nearly 2 million views now, actually, which is good, because my primary goal is for as many people to see what's going on in this country as possible. Because when I first arrived in Ukraine, I was only supposed to be here for 2 or 3 days to film something in Kyiv with John Sweeney, just about the number of people that have been killed here. And when I heard stories from the front line that were harrowing and shocking, and when I ended up going there, it's almost like when you hear a terrible rumor and it rattles around in your brain, and all you can do to cope with it is basically want to tell another person. That's how I feel when I hear stories that happen in Ukraine. I want to capture it, film it, and tell as many people as possible about it so that you can put it to bed in your own mind. And if that, and that requires marketing and packaging it yourself. So,
and there are many aspects of this that I still find very difficult to grasp. Looking back at footage of, say, the Bosnian Wars as Yugoslavia fell apart, you can see in reporting of a couple of decades ago a palpable sense of moral outrage when mass graves are discovered. And it has to point out, for those who don't remember those events, these are Muslims being genocided by, in the main part, Serbs who are Orthodox Christians. But irrespective of the religious aspect, you've got this palpable outrage about the deaths of thousands and thousands of boys and men, especially. And yet here we have Irpin, Bucha, Mariupol, death and slaughter on an extraordinary scale by a country that professes to be Christian, although many of us who've looked into this will understand that the Russian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarch is little more actually than a spy organization, an extension of the KGB, certainly in terms of its hierarchy of leaders. But in Ukraine, there is genuine, I would say, organic Christian belief. And yet it seems that there is not this same sense of outrage. And I struggle to understand it. And I'd love to get your point of view, because on the one hand, the media has changed, and that may just be that we are desensitized. On the other, I fear there may be an imperial aspect to this. Russia is an imperial power, and it has an extraordinary way of soaking up the oxygen, as it were. There may even be some unconscious bias, especially in countries like the US and the UK, which one could describe as former imperial entities. Some people may say that drop the former, that somehow we have this unconscious way of looking at Ukraine as a second-tier country. But I'd love to hear your impressions there. You're on the ground, I'm not, and you may well have some sharp ideas of that.
Well, there's a lot of factors that have led to the West not supporting Ukraine enough. One is about the imperial stuff. The far left in the West is completely bought, compromised, paid for by the USSR. They glamorize it, and China, because they think that they're communists, and they're communists. Stop the War Coalition are pretty selective about which wars they actually want to stop because of things like that, which is despicable. But that is what it is, and that has been the case for a long time. The second is that the media has been incredibly diminished in the last few years. Ad revenue has gone from newspapers to YouTube, and they don't have the ability to report and raise awareness about what's going on in places like Ukraine, like they did in Bosnia and the wars before. The other aspect is that Russian propaganda has become far more influential, sleek, and convincing in the last number of years. That has led to people thinking that there are two sides to this war. By the way, there is not two sides to this war. There's a country that is innocent, this country that has been illegally occupied, invaded, and attempted to be genocided by an occupying dictatorship, fascist regime. But that regime has been pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into propaganda into the West for the last number of years, to soften us up and to convince us that actually they're a Christian country, Ukraine doesn't exist, Ukraine doesn't matter, Ukraine actually is Russia, Ukraine doesn't deserve this. And a lot of that propaganda is working, which is why there's also war fatigue so quickly, which is why there isn't the same interest here. We underestimate the influence, reach, and power of Russian propaganda because our leaders are so slow to understand what's going on in our countries. There was a hearing that was carried out looking into the 2016 interference election with Donald Trump, and one of the judges on the panel didn't understand the difference between a tweet and an email. Now, if you have a judge that doesn't understand the difference between a tweet and an email, that's not a judge that's going to understand how manipulation of algorithms can work through troll bot farms. So we have a justice system that's too slow to even understand how the threat works, never mind understand what the threat is. We have things like the Tenet media scandal, which has only come out because it was so unbelievably obvious. You know, Margarita Simonyan, the head of Russia Today, giving $10 million through shell companies to Lauren Shen to hire 6 high-profile right-wing accounts in the US to spread propaganda, of which Elon Musk retweeted and got hundreds of millions of views, has a serious impact. And there are hundreds more Tenet medias that we haven't found out about in the UK, in the US, and the rest of Europe. There's evidence of this. And so a mix of those three things is the reason that people aren't looking at Ukraine content much anymore, because they don't know what to believe, because our society has been fractured, has been broken through disinformation. And if a society doesn't have a common knowledge, a common understanding about what's true and what isn't, you know, it's okay to have left and right-wing beliefs somewhere on the spectrum, but you should have a shared common knowledge of what is actually true. That's how society has always been. Once that starts to break down, no one knows what to think anymore. And now that's why we're in a situation where we all have a cousin, an uncle, a friend, a doctor, a nurse, someone we know who believes in something batshit. And Russia did that because Russia's been at war with us for a long time. We don't understand the Russian threat, but it's been at war with us for ages. By the time we realize it, it'll be too late. We're acting too little too late. But that's why people aren't engaging in news as much about this country, because they think they switch off when they hear it. They think there's two sides. They think, oh, a sympathetic news report about how prisoners of war in Ukraine are being murdered and genocided. Well, maybe they deserved it because maybe they were kind of half pro-Russian and didn't whatever. Maybe there's two sides to this, even though there isn't. Their brains have already been polluted through Russian propaganda. And we allowed all this to happen. You know, I talked about this before. When Russia took Crimea, Angela Merkel took Putin for a champagne lunch and opened the Nord Stream pipeline because we're intoxicated with the fumes of cheap Russian gas. And we've allowed them to also take over our media. The London Evening Standard is owned by the KGB Lebedevs. I mean, this is just the most ridiculous situation I can imagine. And we're complicit in this war to this extent because we've allowed this to happen for so long.
And Musk is down a very deep rabbit hole. Well, at some point, I'll try to tackle that in a way that doesn't get me sued into oblivion. As an activist, filmmaker, and journalist, you're trying to find ways to package up narratives to tell truthful stories. And to an extent, I'm asked all the time about, you know, how you counter propaganda. And I think I've come to realize that it's not about sort of fact checking this and that and the other. I think it's about being authentic and telling better stories. That's all we've got, just telling better stories. So how do you tackle this? How do you tell better stories than those who are, let's say, professionally mendacious, professional liars?
Well, what I showed in Kherson was the truth. What I showed in Kherson was filmed through it was filmed through kind of a modern day gonzo style of journalism where you're running around basically with your phone unfiltered, capturing everything that's happening to you as a journalist rather than having a. But I filmed that film as if you were there, as if anyone was there. You know, I filmed it arriving at the bus stop, putting my luggage into the back, and then hearing the explosions at night and waking up at 2 a.m. It was a live stream of my consciousness of what was going on at the time. And it was, you know, I was nervous before uploading it because I thought, God, are people going to think this is like tacky and like cringe and TikTok style journalism? Am I going to get, you know, slated for this? But actually, I think people realize that younger people, especially, they like authenticity. You know, their news feeds are pumped with propaganda still, but they like to see authenticity. They like to see a conscious stream, a live stream, and they like to see something that actually emulates the real world rather than polished final products. And I think that's why I applied that type of YouTuber-y TikTok style. It almost was like doing a video as if, you know, you have these travel vloggers going to India and they're going down the street food markets, but in Kherson. It's a very unusual thing to do. But I felt that when I was there, it was the only way to capture it in a way that would get people to understand what it was like to be there and then sympathize with what the people who lived there were going through. If that makes sense.
It does, almost like a real time as well. It's almost like you have to film it as if it's second for second, so people genuinely feel that they're there in the frame.
Yeah, I mean, I would have live streamed the whole thing, but that would have led to me being killed by a drone much quicker because I would be sending out. I don't know if you've watched the full film, but in the film, there is evidence to suggest that my phone had been picked up from the 4G network towers across the Dnipro River, and they had picked me up after I had a phone call and sent a drone towards my IP on my phone. So if I was continuing live streaming throughout the streets, I think that would have, and I think the stream would have ended fairly quickly and dramatically.
So that's it, isn't it?
To capture everything and then leave. Yeah.
Because there are certain dangerous moments, and I've been advised certainly you don't want to switch your phone on or off because that will ping the network, and actually you're going to be transitioning over to networks that probably are monitored by sort of Russian mobile phone towers and so on. It's also possible that you know, taxi drivers and others are paid to monitor and look out for foreigners. So it's a dangerous environment in many different ways.
Oh yeah, I mean the risk that I felt when I was in Kherson last year was from artillery. And you almost have to think of it from a medieval perspective of, as if I always think of Kherson as like a medieval battle of moats. The river is what separates you from the enemy, and they're firing almost like cannonballs through artillery at you, and you're safe from the buildings that face north of that city. It's very geographical, and it's very based on nature, which is very unusual. We don't think of warfare being like that anymore. We think of it as all digital and nuclear, but actually it is pretty much like that. But the threat now is from drones. The artillery is almost redundant, and they can see you everywhere, and saboteurs are everywhere. There's a lot of Russians who have infiltrated that city that are paid quite a lot of money to spot you. So if you're in crowds, if you're speaking English, I mean, I assume I was overheard or seen by a couple of Russian saboteurs because they're that common in that city, and they will send your location to the Russians, and then they'll send a drone after you. They'll say, "There's a journalist here. I've just heard them had a conversation outside a coffee shop." So it's almost it's like a James Bond style situation. I mean, the only analogies that I have to describe that city are Hollywood movies like Mad Max and James Bond, because it's so extreme and unusual. But it's also the reason that I'm leaving Odessa, because I have a friend here who is a journalist for an Canadian newspaper, who has said that he had been followed, and he thought that he had been attempted to be poisoned by Russian saboteurs in this city. And Odessa has a serious problem with saboteurs. They arrested lots of them recently. And I've been advised that I need to move apartments here every single week if I'm to continue living here and having a higher profile doing these kind of documentaries. And it's just not an existence that you can do while making content like this. So that's the main reason I'm going to Kyiv. The MOD is there. It's built for journalists. It's safer. It's got the infrastructure for it. But I don't think enough people really think about that. But it's really a serious problem in the south of Ukraine is saboteurs. Trying to kill you on the ground. The threat in Odessa, I thought, was from the sky. I thought it would be from ballistic missiles that hit the city every day. But it's from the ground, and it's from Russians looking for you.
It's all around, and of course, I assume in Kiev there are a lot more foreigners as well. So you're not, it's more of a needle in a haystack. Whereas, yeah, you may well stand out a lot more in other places. And of course, Russians target activists, don't they? I'm sure they will treat this in a fairly mathematical way. They'll look at who is having an impact on generating funds and fundraisers, who is an activist, who is a strong voice in the community. And the kind of activist journalism, I don't know if you'd call it that, but the kind of activist journalism you're doing is actually the counterweight to the propagandistic style. And, like it or hate it, the propagandists have been rather innovative in capturing the attention, especially of the younger generation of Russians, in the kind of hate-filled formats that they deliver.
Oh yeah, definitely. And the Russians have completely bought into this war. There have been a minimal number of protests against this war in Russia, despite the population being so gigantic, not because it's illegal to protest. It's pretty much illegal to protest in 2014 in this country when the Ukrainians protested to become more westernized and did the Maidan revolution, but they did anyway, because the Russians are indifferent to this war. They bought into the propaganda. It's worked overwhelmingly well. And so there's a huge danger of that. But the main propaganda that has worked, which is complete nonsense, is that there are Russians in Ukraine that want to be Russian. The last remaining Russians that wanted to be Russian that were in Ukraine basically changed their mind when they saw what happened in Izium, in Bucha, in Irpin, and in Kherson, when they saw their brothers and sisters and uncles and friends genocided and tortured under occupation. They were shocked by it. The number one question I asked people when I was in Siversk and in the Donbass was, how do you feel when the Russians come? And they said they were terrified, and they couldn't believe that their Slavic brothers would turn on them like this. So the propaganda that there's any Russians here, there's basically none that are sympathetic. The saboteurs are paid people who have come in here and done this intentionally. But yeah, there's a hardcore, mobilized population in Russia who believe the propaganda and who are fascist and think they're better than Ukrainians, and they wreak havoc on this country through sabotage, which is underreported and crazy. I mean, one of the films I really want to make is actually The Spies of Odessa, and I want to, interview people that have been targeted by such spies, but it's complicated and exhausting to do. And as soon as you go after those networks, without a team and protection, it can actually be even more difficult than documenting war crimes and things like white phosphorus being used. So, it's a complicated environment to be in, and there's a lot of distrust, and it's difficult. But the SBU, the Ukrainian security services, have been pretty on it recently. They've been pretty good at arresting people and finding these networks. But they're pretty significant. It's weird. I didn't even think about the idea of saboteurs existing until Paul Conroy told me about it when I first got to this country, and he said, "Yeah, it's like in Paris during occupation. You had the young Parisian saboteurs, who were targeting the Nazi officers," and he said it's the same thing here in Kherson with Ukrainians doing sabotage during occupation. It's the same thing with the Russians doing sabotage here. So it's crazy concept, but it's everywhere.
It's an absolute mess. And you're not just fighting against, let's say, the sluggishness and indifference of the news media. You're also fighting, when you do get the message out, of course, Russian propaganda is active abroad. Now we're going to turn to that appalling example of Russians at War, a documentary film, which was funded to the tune of hundreds of thousands of Canadian dollars. Unfortunately, this kind of stuff also gets through. This also has some kind of market. It trickles through to suggest the idea that there are two sides, that Russians are people too, etc., etc. It whitewashes the crimes. It shows a very, very, let's say, narrow slice of the life or experience of occupiers, if indeed it is showing any kind of reality at all. The challenge here is that this taps into something that we are desperate to believe that normalcy will return, desperate to believe that Russians are not doing the monstrous things, not capable of the monstrous things that they're doing. Somehow it can be back to business as normal. We can stick our heads in the sand and forget about it. Second World War, all that stuff, we're fascinated by it when there's 70 years, 80 years distance. We cannot face that reality now. And Russian propaganda lulls us to sleep, tells us actually you don't have to. It's not really something you need concern yourself with.
Mm-hmm. Well, I like the idea. Liberals like to believe the best in people, and most of us actually in the West like to believe the best in people and like to believe that we can all change and improve. I like that too. I used to make, right-wing media when I was a kid, and now I don't. I changed and improved. But that is actually not the same for everywhere. Russia has not changed since the Second World War. Russia has not changed basically at all. It is the same type of society that has existed way before the Soviet Union fell. And we know that because when Putin interviewed Tucker interviewed Putin, all Tucker could talk about was the glory days of the USSR and the history and the past, because that's where Russia is stuck. And we have to also understand and realize that we're not all the same. The mentality and mindset and culture that we have in Britain and the way that we think of human rights is not the same way that Russians think about human rights and think about other people. We are all different. We all have different cultures. And the culture in Russia, I'm sorry to say, is rotten. We see this because they have over 100 cities across 7 time zones, and that still isn't enough. Unfortunately, those cities don't work because they're full of Russians. They're dysfunctional, so they need more. They need to expand more. The people in Russia are indifferent to this war because they don't see Ukrainians as human beings. That's why they don't protest against this. That's why so many of them sign up for a minimum wage to join this war against Ukraine. And there is a sickness at the heart of Russia that started in Moscow and the Kremlin and permeated across that country. And we have to look at that society differently to how we look at our own society, as a serious threat. We don't look at North Korea and think, they'll change, they'll get better. You know, we don't look at rogue extreme states like that and believe the best in them, but we do with Russia, despite it being actually worse than North Korea, because North Korea at least aren't actually actively trying to expand and genocide their neighbors right now. And that's because Russian propaganda has been so successful in our societies for so long. They have humanized themselves through the tentacles of the Kremlin propaganda for decades. They did this through things like Russians at War, through the film festival circuit. They weaponize and use every single form of Western media possible to get their putrid propaganda out. They did this with Russia Today. They had offices in Millbank Tower that would pump out stuff onto our news feeds, endlessly creating divisions, and actually contributed to the race riots in the country that we saw in Britain this year, which is connected to Russia propaganda. They did this through YouTube channels that they paid tens of millions of dollars to Americans to pump out the same kind of Russian propaganda that said that Russia was great and based and Christian and lovely and look how beautiful Moscow is. They paid, I think, people like Tucker to do the same thing. And they do it at film festivals because that's where nice, loving liberals and nice, loving Westerners go to watch films that shape their worldview. And they do it every single place they possibly can. And I think we just need to stop looking at Russia as a serious country and as a country that can improve and as a country that is in any way the other side to this war, because it isn't. It's a hostile force. We need to look at Russian army like it is ISIS, because it behaves like ISIS. ISIS were one of the first military groups in the world to mean that Western press stopped wearing the word press on their jackets because they started specifically targeting them. Well, I don't wear the word press on my jacket anymore when I go to Kherson because the Russian army also specifically target press and civilians in the same way that ISIS did. So we need to start looking at the Kremlin and looking at Russia in that same way. But we don't, because we bought into their lies. We bought their cheap Russian gas money. And we've also allowed London, the capital of our country, to become the money laundering capital of the world, the Russian money laundering capital of the world. John and I did a documentary about this a couple of years ago. And it's infuriating. And I get annoyed talking about it because I've seen firsthand on the ground in this country what the Russians do to civilians. And there is not two sides to it. And the cushiness and the relaxed nature that our governments and a lot of our politicians look at Russia with is wrong. And I actually wish that a lot of them would spend just 2 days in Kherson like I did. And then they might realize that the Russian threat is as real as it is, and might stop buying and believing propaganda like they are. But, you know, there are two sides to a lot of wars. There are two sides to a lot of situations in the world. You know, when the Civil War happens, there are usually two sides. We like to look at things like that. But there wasn't two sides in World War II when the Nazis killed 6 million Jews. There wasn't two sides when we realized the genocide that had been carried out by Hitler. But we're looking at something which was the exact same situation with nuance 80 years later. And it's false. It's a false equivalency. History will tell us this 20 years down the line. But in the fog of war and the mess of war, information is chaotic. Information is hard to get out. And things are a mess. You know, I imagine in 1943 or throughout that period, there was still a lot of the same kind of confusion about whose side was doing what. And it wasn't probably until the 1950s and 60s that actual documentaries and films and really good books started coming out, looking back and analyzing what happened in Nazi Germany. And people really started to get it then. So maybe it'll be the same situation here. Maybe it'll be 20 years from now, people really see what happened. But at the moment, gosh, it doesn't feel anywhere close to that.
I was going to say something along those lines, that until the Nazis were categorically defeated and even the re-education program started kicking in, there sort of were two sides, and you may not buy into the other side, but there was another story being told. That story eventually lost, and there was no military or civilian power to prop it up. The challenge we have here is that Russia is unlikely to be conquered and occupied. And so the narratives that we see will carry on multiplying, will carry on evolving. there will always be pumped out alternative version that these things didn't happen. Those weren't really crimes. What about? What about Iraq? What about Syria? What about Gaza? What about this? What about that? What about the other?
Yep.
What you've picked up on, I think, is something both interesting but also disturbing. You've taken what's happened in, or what's happening in Kherson day after day, the way Russians are using modern technology to hunt people, not just military, but to hunt civilians going about their daily business. It's truly horrific. But I know this isn't the term you came up with. It's a term that actually a propagandist used. So that is genuinely, reporting of what's going on and the name that's being used for it. But at the same time, it seems to get the story out. It's not enough for it to be horrific, not enough for it to be inhumane and disgusting and everything. It has to be packaged up in a certain way. It has to click in an editor's brain like, oh, hang on a second, this story sounds a little bit like, the Hunger Games or the Squid Game. Right, yeah, we'll go with this because we can do something. It's no longer a reflection of reality or morality or any of these things. It sounds as if you have to pitch something like an entertainment format to cut through.
Yeah, and that's because we digest information in a very different way now than we did before. We on average consume 300 foot of newsfeed every single day. If you printed out our news feeds, it would be the length of a football stadium, and it's amount of information that we are not designed to consume every day as human beings. And it's also information that has been curated to be shown to us from an algorithm that wants us to agree with it or be angry by it. And this is unprecedented. We don't even know how dangerous the impact is and is going to be until probably 5 or 10 years from now. But the only way to get a message out and stories out in a lot of ways is to do the type of marketing that I did with that film, and is to come up with those names. But also, human beings are people that resonate with stories. I could tell you that 300,000 people were killed in a terror attack yesterday, and you go, gosh, that's crazy. Or I could say there was a woman holding a pink teddy bear for her 3-year-old daughter, and she had pink shoes, and she fell out of a window and almost survived. And then, the second wave hit and a roof landed, and that's when it was too late. And then you feel the human impact, and I think phrases like human safari and phrases like that are kind of important for captivating audiences as well. I mean, as human beings, we originated our language through gathering around fires tens of thousands of years ago, when we came up with even the ideas of religion, and we passed down knowledge by storytelling and telling each other stories of gods and historical battles and things. And you almost need the basics of storytelling to get things across in that old school way, so that people can remember it in a way that they can relate to. So, I don't think it's an unethical thing. I think it's a human thing, but you have to do more of it now because you've got to compete with, the constant thumb that's scrolling past your video every 2 seconds and rage bait and clickbait. It's going to get much harder in the future to compete with a lot of this stuff because I think there's probably a year left of us actually having some sort of cohort, relative, common understanding of society. And then I think AI will basically mean that you can generate a video of anyone saying anything, holding any microphone with any brand on it. And then we'll reach information end times. So I also am very pessimistic about where things are going. This is really like the last bit of us having any kind of common sense of understanding. This is like the last 11th hour.
I'm going to be doing a lot more. I mean, you've read my mind. I'm doing a lot more videos on that. That's a particular sort of pet subject of mine, coming from a marketing background, coming from a technology background, spending, the last couple of decades on the wrong side, I would say, being a commercial propagandist. I absolutely agree with you. The impact of it is truly terrifying, and we are in no way ready for it. In that sense, though, we still need human beings to tell stories. My sort of concluding question is, well, what's next for you? How are you going to continue honing and refining and building the audience for the kind of authoritative stories that you tell, and indeed the innovation in formats and the way they're told? Because clearly legacy media is absolutely not up to the job?
I don't know what's going to happen next, really. I didn't plan Kherson until 2 days before I went, and I just got on a bus and went because I saw a video of a drone dropping a grenade onto a public bus, a yellow bus, and it was the most clear-cut evidence that it was civilians they were targeting. And I booked a taxi there and then, well, the bus there and then to the city. So I want my content to be really responsive based on what's going on in this country. There's now evidence come out that in Zaporizhia, they're using drones to kill civilians in villages as pilot practice, so that before they send those pilots to the front in the east, which is even more shocking. It's practice. I might do something on that. The Russians have also just carried out ecocide on one of the main rivers that runs through this country. I kind of want to hire a boat and go down that river and show the sheer chaos and devastation that they've done. There's a lot going on. I want it to be really responsive, but I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen next. I'm honestly exhausted from Kherson. It was a huge amount to go through personally. Nothing compared to what the residents there have to go through every day, but it was more shocking than I thought it was. And I edited that 15 hours a day every single day for a week to get it out as quickly as possible. So I need to mentally reset, get to Kyiv, and then make the next film. But I don't know, maybe I'll do a show in Kyiv, maybe I'll keep making documentaries. I just feel like being responsive, grabbing your camera when something feels hot, when something feels important, and getting it out is the strategy right now. And I hope that it continues to work.
Well, we're glad you're there on the ground. We're glad you have the energy to do this and that it is impactful. I think it is desperately needed at this time. Caolan, thank you so much for coming on the channel, and I really hope we'll get to do this again soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. This was a great chat.